I opened the back door and screamed. My brand new pool, the one I'd spent 2 years saving for, was now a swirling mess of thick, oily paint. Red, yellow, blue, every color imaginable blended like a bad toddler's art project. The once pristine water was now a toxic soup. My daughter, who had been so excited for her swimming lessons, stood beside me in her floaties, eyes wide and trembling. She asked if the pool was bleeding. I didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or punch a wall. But the worst part wasn't the mess. It was the figure I spotted in the corner of my security camera footage at 2:42 a.m. A woman in gloves holding 2 paint cans, hopping my fence like she was in a Mission Impossible movie. That woman was Karen, our HOA's vice president, backyard tyrant, and self-declared protector of neighborhood aesthetics. And she had no idea that this time I had her on camera and the police on speed dial. It all started 3 months earlier when construction on the pool began. I'd hired the most reputable contractor in the county, filed all the necessary permits, and posted the mandatory construction notice as required by the HOA guidelines. Karen, of course, found a problem with everything. The noise was too loud, the workers parked too crooked, she claimed the color of the tiles, Pacific Ocean blue, didn't match the neighborhood's desert earth tone palette. I politely explained that the pool was in my backyard, visible only to me and the clouds. She sneered and said, "We'll see how long that lasts." By the time the pool was completed, Karen had lodged 11 complaints. None stuck. The HOA board, tired of her theatrics, dismissed them all. I thought that might finally shut her down. I was wrong. She simply changed tactics. Instead of formal complaints, she started casually walking her dog past my yard at least 6 times a day, snapping pictures and pretending to text. Her dog, an overweight Pomeranian named Sir Winston, seemed as fed up as I was. A week after the pool was filled, I threw a small get-together, just a handful of friends, some music, grilled kebabs, and an inflatable flamingo my daughter named Rosie. Karen stood outside her fence with binoculars. At one point, she shouted, "You'll regret this nonsense when the algae take over." My guests laughed it off. I didn't. Something about the way she said it made my skin crawl. That's when I decided to install cameras. I told my wife it was just for peace of mind. Truth was, I had a gut feeling. Karen had already yanked out a no trespassing sign from another neighbor's property during a feud over mailbox placement. If she'd do that, what would stop her from messing with my pool? I bought a high-res motion detecting system with night vision and tucked the small black lenses under the patio awning and inside the decorative bushes lining the poolside. I didn't tell anyone, not even my kids. It wasn't paranoia if someone was actually out to get you. 2 nights before the paint incident, I noticed Karen loitering near the front gate again. This time she was wearing gloves, not gardening gloves. These were black nitrile gloves, the kind mechanics use. She stood for about 30 seconds, looked around, then slowly walked away. I didn't think much of it until the morning of the disaster. The sun had just risen. My wife made coffee, and I stepped out with our daughter to prep for her morning swim. She was already wearing her mermaid swimsuit, the one with sequins that change color when you touch them. I remember her holding her nose and pointing. "Why is there jelly in the pool, Daddy?" I looked down and froze. It wasn't jelly. It was paint. Thick layers of it, some settled in blobs along the bottom like alien growths. The inflatables were ruined. The pump system, already humming from the night's circulation, was now churning like it was gasping for breath. I didn't speak. I just walked straight inside, opened the camera feed, and rewound. And there she was, Karen, in a hoodie and nitrile gloves, her face partially visible as she lifted 2 5-gallon buckets over the fence. She didn't spill a drop until she was ready. Then, with deliberate care, she poured 1 can, paused, checked over her shoulder, then poured the second. Her posture was calm, calculated, not a prank, not some heat-of-the-moment rage. This was a deliberate act of sabotage. I showed the footage to my wife. Her first words were, "Call the police." I agreed, but I also wanted to do it right. I remembered what my lawyer friend Brian told me years ago. If someone's out to destroy you, let them dig the whole hole before you shove them in. so I copied the footage to a USB. I documented everything: the date, time, weather, the value of damages, and even Karen's previous complaints. I wasn't just planning to call the police. I was preparing for war. Later that day, Karen had the audacity to stroll by again. She didn't even look in my direction, just walked slowly, sipping from a stainless steel mug like she was on a beach vacation. My daughter stood at the gate, holding Rosie the flamingo by the neck, the toy dripping paint. She asked, "Is Miss Karen going to help us clean?" I smiled and said, "No, sweetie, but she's going to be very famous soon." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the patio watching the camera feed in real time. My wife offered me tea. I declined. The adrenaline was pumping. Karen didn't know it yet, but her entire house of cards was about to collapse. What she thought was a petty act of revenge was, in fact, a felony, and I had every pixel of it stored in 4 angles, 1080p, with a timestamp so precise it could have been used by NASA. She had messed with the wrong person, and she was about to learn that while she played HOA politics, I had the legal equivalent of a nuclear warhead ready to launch. She dumped paint in my pool, but I was about to paint the courtroom with her lies. The morning after discovering the paint disaster, I kept things calm, at least on the surface. Karen had no clue I had her cold on camera. I wasn't going to give her a hint either. While she continued her morning charade, walking Sir Winston in slow, overdramatic circles around the neighborhood, I made a series of quiet moves. First, I called my insurance company to see if anything could be covered. The answer was a disappointing no. Vandalism like this wasn't included under our policy unless there was forced entry, or unless the suspect was arrested and charged. Basically, they told me to file a police report and circle back. That was fine. I intended to do exactly that. But not yet. Instead of rushing to the cops immediately, I made a calculated decision. I reached out to Brian, my old college roommate, and now a sharp, no-nonsense civil litigation attorney. I told him everything, sent him the video clips, the HOA complaint letters, the timeline of Karen's obsessive antics, and even screenshots of neighborhood messages where she hinted about her plans to restore neighborhood order. He called me within minutes, and I could almost hear him smiling through the phone. He said I had enough to bury her, and advised me to let her keep digging. That's when we both agreed. Let's bait her into more. I needed more damage, more actions, and more proof that this wasn't a one-time emotional outburst. It was targeted harassment. So I went quiet publicly, but behind the scenes, I got strategic. I drained the pool, painful, expensive, and stinking like oil sludge, and left it empty and visibly stained. The bright blue liner now had ghost-like swirls of red and yellow smeared into it. It looked like a crime scene, which wasn't far from the truth. I placed a few obvious but fragile new things around the yard. A water filtration unit box I picked up from a recycling bin, a fake motion sprinkler labeled sensitive components, and an inflatable unicorn floaty with glitter bought from the clearance aisle. All of it was junk, really, but visually tempting. Then I activated the cameras, adjusted the angles to catch every inch of fence line, and waited. Sure enough, Karen took the bait. Just 2 nights later, I caught her again. This time, she came at 1:13 a.m., wearing the same gloves and a ridiculous trench coat like she thought she was in some kind of noir thriller. She snuck around the side yard and dropped what looked like fertilizer or weed killer into the fake sprinkler housing. Then she stabbed the unicorn float with a screwdriver. It was surreal watching a grown woman viciously attack a pool toy like it had insulted her family. And again, she left without a sound, like a ghost. Only this ghost was now documented in 4 different camera angles with night vision clarity. By now, I had hours of footage, timestamps, and a full incident report ready to go. But the neighborhood still didn't know what was going on. I couldn't say anything yet, but I could watch the chaos unfold. Karen began spinning a narrative almost immediately. She started a whisper campaign, walking over to different neighbors and suggesting our family was unstable, that I was neglecting the pool, and that maybe we weren't suited to live in such a peaceful community. My neighbor Rachel, a friendly nurse with a pit bull and a solid memory, texted me to say Karen had even implied I was on probation and that the paint incident was probably something I did myself for attention. It was maddening, but oddly entertaining. Every lie she told made my eventual reveal that much more satisfying. I attended the next HOA meeting, calm and quiet, sitting in the back with a notebook and a USB drive in my pocket. Karen strutted in like a peacock, talking loudly about how some people just don't understand the importance of visual harmony, and what a shame it is when individuals neglect their responsibilities. She even motioned toward me with her coffee cup and said, "Some folks just don't belong in community living." I nodded, smiled, and stayed silent. But that night, I backed up the footage to multiple devices, uploaded it to cloud storage, and sent a copy to Brian with a note. Game on. The next morning, I finally filed the official police report. I handed them a flash drive, a printed timeline, and a witness list. The officer who reviewed it raised an eyebrow and asked if this was real. I told him it was all recorded just days ago. He watched the clip of Karen pouring paint, sighed, and muttered, "People are out of their damn minds." A criminal mischief case was opened that afternoon, but Karen still didn't know what was coming. She strolled past my house the next day and had the nerve to call out, "You know, a good neighbor would just let things go. People make mistakes." I didn't respond. I just looked her in the eye, held up my phone, and clicked the camera shutter button, not even pointing it at her. She flinched and rushed off. 2 days later, she escalated again. A letter arrived in my mailbox with the HOA header and Karen's signature. It was an official citation for failure to maintain acceptable yard aesthetics. She claimed the drained pool, paint stains, and debris were all violations of community standards. She gave me 48 hours to clean it up or face daily fines. It was ridiculous, of course, especially since she was the one who caused the damage. But it was also perfect. This documented HOA harassment would go beautifully with the vandalism case. I scanned the letter, added it to the growing digital folder labeled Karen Evidence, and forwarded a copy to Brian. His reply was quick and beautiful. "We're going to make her wish she'd never heard the word pool." At this point, even other neighbors were growing suspicious. Karen's obsession with my yard, her increasingly unhinged gossip, and her bizarre nightly walks had caught attention. One neighbor even put up a parody sign in their own yard. Warning: artistic pool may offend HOA sensibilities. Karen had it taken down within hours, citing visual pollution. Every new action she took only sealed her fate further, and I wasn't going to stop it. I was going to keep watching, keep collecting, and when the moment came, I was going to detonate the whole mountain of evidence in front of her, the HOA, and the law. She thought I was the weak one for staying quiet. What she didn't know was that silence wasn't surrender. It was setup. The third escalation came not with a bang, but with an envelope. It was hand-delivered by Karen herself, sealed with an unnecessary piece of golden tape and smelling like one of her overpriced lavender candles. She didn't even knock. She just strutted up the porch in her usual yoga gear, sunglasses on despite the overcast sky, and slipped the envelope through the mail slot like she was delivering a royal decree. I stood inside, watching from the kitchen window, wondering if she ever felt even a sliver of self-awareness. The woman had dumped chemicals into my pool, destroyed my kids' inflatable toys, and trespassed multiple times. But here she was, acting like I was the one who had upset the balance of the universe. I waited until she walked off again, with that mug in her hand and Sir Winston struggling to keep up, and then picked up the envelope. Inside was a notice, a formal one this time, typed in a nauseating cursive font claiming that my property was now officially under visual violation review. Karen had cited 5 separate clauses from the HOA agreement, all twisted beyond recognition, and declared that my yard had become an eyesore to the peaceful character of the community. The empty pool, she said, constituted a safety hazard. The filter box, which she herself had tampered with, was labeled as improperly stored equipment. And the cherry on top, she demanded that the stained inflatable unicorn be removed because it triggered feelings of neighborhood instability. I laughed out loud at that one. My wife didn't. She just folded the letter fully and said, "It's time." But I wasn't quite ready to pull the trigger. Not yet. I wanted her to believe she was winning. I needed her comfortable and arrogant, not cautious. So I did something she didn't expect. I removed everything. I packed up the fake filter box, tossed the glittery unicorn, and covered the pool with a cheap blue tarp from the hardware store. It now looked like a backyard in quiet cleanup mode. Nothing flashy, nothing to photograph. I didn't even attend the next HOA meeting. I let her have her moment. Predictably, Karen took the silence as surrender. She began gloating openly at the mailbox. She bragged to a group of neighbors that some people finally learned their place. She told one couple that I was on thin ice, and another that the HOA might even vote to seize the yard for community use. That last one wasn't even legally possible, but she said it with such confidence that people started to believe her. Rumors flew. People began approaching me with nervous smiles, unsure of what to say. A few offered help, but most just seemed wary of getting caught in whatever madness was unfolding between me and the self-appointed queen of the block. Then, one night, she crossed the final line. I was in the living room, checking security footage like I did every night, when motion was triggered at the side gate. It was past 1:00 a.m. Karen appeared, wearing a hoodie and carrying something under her arm. She crept across the yard like she was on a stealth mission and headed straight for the pool tarp. I watched in silence, heart pounding. She stood over the pool for a moment, then pulled out a bag of what I later learned was powdered grout. She slashed the tarp with a box cutter and began dumping the powder into the pool basin. I didn't even flinch. I simply pressed record, clip-saved the footage, and texted Brian. By morning, the powder had hardened in large chunks, fusing with the paint already stuck to the liner. The pool was officially wrecked. I took photos from multiple angles, printed timestamps, filed a follow-up with the officer on our case, and scheduled a hazmat evaluation. The inspector, a grizzled man in his 60s with a smoker's cough, took one look and said, "Someone hates you, huh?" I just smiled and said, "Oh, you have no idea." The damage total was now nearing $10,000, and it was all documented. The officer handling the case called to confirm that charges would be filed soon. Karen would be hit with criminal mischief, trespassing, and destruction of property. But that still wasn't enough for me. This wasn't just about legal consequences. It was about truth. Karen had poisoned my pool, my yard, and my name in the neighborhood. I wanted everything exposed, publicly and undeniably. So I reached out to a popular Reddit account that specialized in neighborhood horror stories. I sent them the footage, blurred just enough to avoid legal issues, but still clear enough to tell the story, and wrote a detailed post titled, "HOA Karen dumped paint and grout in my pool. Didn't know I had her on 4 cameras." I didn't include names or addresses, just the facts. Within 24 hours, the post exploded. Thousands of upvotes, hundreds of comments, people sharing similar experiences, laughing, fuming, demanding justice. It went viral. Karen found out 2 days later. She marched onto my driveway, holding a printed copy of the Reddit post in one hand and her phone in the other. Her face was a twisted mask of rage. She accused me of defamation, of cyberbullying, of ruining her image. She was screaming loud enough that neighbors peeked out from curtains and doors. I didn't say a word. I simply pointed to the camera above the garage and mouthed the words, "You're being recorded." She paused. For the first time since this war began, she looked genuinely panicked. Not angry, not smug, just afraid. She left in a hurry. The next morning, 2 police officers arrived at her door with a citation in hand and a notice of pending charges. I watched from my porch as she tried to argue, flail her arms, and then eventually slump in silence. Sir Winston barked furiously at the officers, who ignored him completely. That evening, I received an email from the HOA president. It said an emergency meeting was scheduled for the next week. Karen's conduct was under review, and several members had demanded her removal. I replied with a simple message, "Happy to attend. I'll bring the footage." For the first time in weeks, the house felt calm. My wife made us all lemonade, and we sat on the back patio, staring at the covered pool, which still looked awful, but no longer felt cursed. My daughter climbed into my lap and asked, "Is the pool okay now?" I kissed her forehead and said, "It will be, sweetheart, just like everything else. because now, finally, Karen's mess wasn't mine to clean up anymore. The emergency HOA meeting took place in the community clubhouse, a beige-painted room with flickering fluorescent lights and folding chairs that always smelled like old coffee and forced civility. By the time I arrived, the room was already buzzing. Word had spread fast. It wasn't just the viral Reddit post anymore. It was the police visit, the fines, the rumors, and most importantly, the undeniable sense that Karen had finally gone too far. People who had never spoken to me before nodded as I passed. Some whispered to each other, their eyes darting toward the front where Karen sat stiffly in her chair, arms crossed and lips pressed in a tight line. She wore a blazer like she was going to trial, not realizing that's exactly what this had become. The HOA president, Mr. Thompson, was visibly uncomfortable. He tolerated Karen's antics for years, mostly because she volunteered for everything and did most of the paperwork no one else wanted to touch. But even he looked like he'd had enough. He cleared his throat, shuffled his papers, and called the meeting to order. Karen immediately raised her hand and began speaking before being recognized, launching into a breathless monologue about online bullying, character assassination, and how someone had digitally manipulated footage of her to spread false accusations. She played the victim with practiced skill, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. A few people looked concerned, but most didn't seem convinced. Some looked annoyed. One neighbor actually rolled their eyes so hard I thought they might pass out. When she was done, Mr. Thompson turned to me. "Would you like to respond?" I stood up slowly, pulled a USB drive from my pocket, and walked over to the projector station. I didn't say anything for the first few seconds. I just clicked play. The first video showed Karen dumping the paint into the pool at 2:42 a.m., clear as day. The second showed her slashing the tarp and dumping grout. The third showed her trespassing into the yard and stabbing the unicorn float. And finally, the fourth showed her screaming in my driveway about being defamed. Each clip had timestamps, camera angles, and sound. No music, no effects, just reality. When it ended, the room was silent. Someone coughed. Karen looked like her spine had turned to stone. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Mr. Thompson turned to the rest of the room and asked, "Does anyone have any questions?" No one did. Instead, a woman in the back, Mrs. Whitaker, who usually kept to herself, stood up and asked why the board had tolerated Karen's behavior for so long. That broke the dam. One by one, neighbors started voicing their experiences. Petty fines, threats, manipulated reports. One man said Karen fined him for having a garden gnome with an aggressive posture. Another said she made him remove his porch wind chimes because they were too whimsical. As each person spoke, Karen shrank a little more in her seat. The vote wasn't even close. 14-2. Karen was removed from the board, effective immediately. Her access to HOA systems, documents, and decision-making privileges was revoked. She was told she could remain a homeowner, but she was forbidden from holding any official capacity or initiating policy enforcement against any resident. The HOA would also be reviewing its conduct rules to prevent future abuse of authority. It was the closest thing to a public execution I'd ever seen, and it was glorious. But it didn't end there. 2 days later, I received a call from the police department. The case had moved forward. Karen was being charged with trespassing, destruction of private property, and criminal mischief. Because of the dollar amount involved in damages and the calculated nature of her actions, the charges were elevated beyond simple misdemeanors. She was ordered to appear in court the following week. Brian, my attorney friend, was practically vibrating with excitement. He told me we had a strong civil case for restitution, emotional distress, and potentially even punitive damages if the judge was feeling spicy. I wasn't even thinking about money at that point. I just wanted Karen to face the full weight of what she'd done. The court date arrived, and I dressed like I was going to a job interview, calm, professional, unshakable. Karen, on the other hand, looked like she'd aged a decade in a week. Her hair was unkempt, her face pale. She no longer had that air of smug superiority. Now she just looked tired and cornered. Her lawyer tried to argue that the acts were out of character, that she'd had a difficult year, and that she was under stress due to conflicts in the community. The judge listened politely and then asked if the footage was real and unaltered. After I confirmed, he watched the clips silently, eyes narrowing as each new clip played. When it was done, he sighed, looked at Karen and said, "You deliberately and repeatedly violated your neighbor's property rights, endangered their family, and undermined trust in a residential community. That's not stress. That's malice." The ruling was swift. Karen was ordered to pay full restitution for the pool damage, court fees, and an additional fine for criminal mischief. She was also sentenced to 50 hours of community service, which ironically included working at the local community center right across the street from our neighborhood. When the gavel fell, I didn't cheer. I didn't smile. I just nodded once and walked out with my wife, hand in hand, knowing it was finally over. The aftermath was surprisingly peaceful. Karen stopped walking Sir Winston. Her house went dark most evenings. I heard whispers she was considering moving. The pool was cleaned professionally, relined, refilled, and finally looked like the oasis I had always envisioned. Rosie the flamingo was long gone, but my daughter picked out a new float shaped like a narwhal and named it Karen. It became a neighborhood joke almost instantly. At the next community gathering, I brought lemonade and barbecue, and people actually talked to me like I was human. One of the same neighbors who used to avoid eye contact gave me a side hug and said, "Glad someone finally stood up to her." I just smiled. It wasn't about standing up. It was about watching closely, documenting quietly, and striking decisively when the time was right. I installed a new wooden sign near the pool gate that read, "Smile." Karen did too, right before the cops showed up. People took selfies with it. Kids laughed. Life returned to normal, better than before. Karen tried to make me a cautionary tale. She didn't realize I was the one writing the story. The summer rolled in hotter than usual, but for once, it was peaceful. The chaos that had gripped my backyard, and really, the entire neighborhood, had finally faded into distant memory. Well, distant for everyone except Karen. After the court ruling and her community service assignment, she became a ghost of her former self. The loud, condescending voice that used to echo down the street during her morning walks had vanished. Sir Winston still appeared occasionally, now being walked by a teenage dog sitter, while Karen kept the curtains drawn and her porch light off. Her front yard, once immaculately manicured to the point of obsession, started to grow weeds. Her signature lavender wreath disappeared from the door. Even her trash cans, which she used to keep perfectly aligned and power washed every Friday, now sat out crooked for days after pickup. She had faded not just from power, but from the neighborhood's attention. Meanwhile, my family and I finally reclaimed what was ours. The pool, completely redone with a new liner and a high-tech filtration system, gleamed under the sun. It was more than just water and tiles. It was a symbol of survival and justice, a space we had fought for and won. We hosted our first big event since the incident, a backyard barbecue that doubled as a community celebration. Nearly every neighbor came, including those who had previously avoided eye contact or stayed neutral. People brought food, folding chairs, and even their own pool floats. My daughter, with glitter sunscreen on her cheeks, floated proudly on her new narwhal, named Karen, laughing every time someone called it by name. A few neighbors cautiously asked about the court outcome, unsure if it was polite to bring up. I kept my responses light and brief. The case had been settled. Restitution was being paid in monthly checks, and Karen had been stripped of all HOA authority. Most people nodded in approval and quickly moved on to lighter topics, but the undertone was clear. They were grateful someone had finally held her accountable. One man, a retired firefighter who lived 3 doors down, clapped me on the back and said, "Took a while, but Dan, you nailed it. We all owed you for that." I didn't need their thanks, but it felt good to have the quiet support confirmed. Even better was seeing how the HOA began to change after Karen's fall. The new board, elected shortly after her removal, had a very different tone. They focused on actual maintenance, stopped with the petty fines, and opened meetings to wider community input. The mood of the entire neighborhood shifted. People planted flowers without fear of citations. Kids rode bikes down the street without parents being scolded for excessive driveway noise. It was like someone had lifted a fog. Still, part of me knew Karen wasn't done. She had retreated, sure, but retreat wasn't surrender. It was regrouping. I kept the cameras up, updated the system, and checked the feeds weekly. Not because I expected another attack, but because I knew how bitterness lingered. Sometimes people don't learn from consequences. Sometimes they just wait for a crack to crawl back through. And sure enough, one evening near the end of summer, I spotted her. It was just a brief flash, her car slowly rolling past my driveway, windows up, no music, no dog. She didn't stop or make eye contact, but the intent was clear. She was checking, watching, maybe hoping I'd slip up, maybe just haunted by the fact that her reign had ended not with applause but with footage and court orders. I didn't report it. I didn't react. I simply made a mental note and went back inside. A week later, something strange happened. I received a letter. No envelope, just a folded piece of paper slipped into my mailbox. No return address, no name, just a typed message. You made your point. I hope you're happy. That was it. No threat, no apology, just a bitter sentence that carried the weight of everything Karen couldn't say out loud. I showed it to my wife, who shook her head and said, she still doesn't get it. She was right. Karen hadn't learned. She hadn't taken responsibility. She'd just been forced to stop. That wasn't remorse. It was defeat, and even in her silence, she resented it. But I didn't dwell on it. I had no interest in dragging the feud any further. I made my point with evidence, not revenge. I had shown the truth, let the law do its work, and restored my family's peace. That was enough. Still, I filed the letter in a folder labeled Karen Residuals, just in case it ever came up again. Experience had taught me that the past doesn't always stay buried. As fall approached, I added a final touch to the pool area, a wooden sign, custom engraved and mounted to the fence. It read, Skeuushin, area under surveillance. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Ask Karen. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't entirely necessary, but it got laughs. Guests took pictures next to it, kids made jokes, and even my mailman complimented the craftsmanship. My daughter painted little stars on it with glow-in-the-dark paint, and every time it lit up at night, I felt a strange satisfaction. Not spite, just closure. The story of Karen and the pool became a sort of neighborhood legend. New residents heard bits and pieces. Some asked if it was true. I just nod and say, let's just stay you're safe to plant roses now. And that was the legacy. Not the destruction, not the stress, not even the court case, but the reminder that even in the pettiest, most ridiculous conflicts, standing your ground with patience and proof could win. Not everything needed a screaming match or a door-to-door campaign. Sometimes justice worked just fine when delivered quietly, pixel by pixel. Months passed. The neighborhood changed. Kids got older. Trees shed their leaves. Karen's house stayed mostly quiet. I heard she tried to sell it, but no one wanted to buy. Some said it was cursed. I said nothing. One evening in early December, long after the pool had been closed for the season, I sat on the patio with a cup of tea, looking out over the yard. It was calm. No sirens, no paint, just the cool breeze and the faint hum of the pool cover's motor. My daughter came outside with a blanket and asked if she could sit with me. I wrapped it around both of us, and we sat in silence. Then she whispered, "Daddy, is Karen still mad?" I thought for a second and said, maybe, but it doesn't matter because we're okay.